And we've done some related work to change social and cultural norms. We know that gender inequality creates the conditions for violence, and that we won't eliminate it until the world is more gender equal. However, I have reservations about the humanitarian community, humanitarian practitioners, to actually work on this issue. I don't think it's our mandate. I don't think it's within our time frame, and I don't think it's our expertise. Does it need to happen? Yes. Do we need to leave it to the people who are going to be there longer term? I think so. So what do we need to figure out? We need to figure out how to systematically mitigate risk and the prevention of GBV, and then how to measure that. That's the challenge we have with our donors. How do we know that a single intervention is actually reducing exposure? You know, because we did this, 50 less women were raped. We can never say that. But what kind of proxy indicators can we develop to say we're actually enhancing this protection environment? We're mitigating some of that exposure to risk at least. We at the Women's Refugee Commission came up with the following areas where we think the humanitarians have both a responsibility and the tools to prevent gender-based violence. Some of this is pretty obvious. I mean, we know what some of these risk factors are. It's insecurity and the lack of physical protection. It's the lack of basic and survival needs. It's the lack of opportunities, economic, educational, and social. So first, in terms of the physical security, I mean, I always call this the 3 L's, lights, locks, and latrines. We still don't do this stuff. And why aren't we doing this? What's the problem? I mean, we need measures of accountability to ensure that all of those actors on the ground are actually living up to those agreed to international standards. Because again, if we don't do this right from the beginning, some of the harm is irreversible. If the water pump is placed near the soccer field, and 3 months later, all the girls are saying, every time we go to fetch water, we are harassed by all of those boys, nobody's gonna move that pump. That money's been spent, those guys are gone. Those guys who put it in are gone. So we have to get it right from the start. Second, those basic survival needs. What we know is that populations, when they're unable to meet their basic needs, people will do whatever they can to survive, to provide for themselves and their families. Girls will trade their bodies for food. They will trade their bodies for grades. They will trade their bodies for clothing. Women will risk rape when they go out to collect firewood so that they can cook food for their families. Women and girls will turn to prostitution as a source of income when they have no other source of income. So when we as a humanitarian community do not or are not able to deliver enough aid to raise uprooted people above a level of desperation and misery, we're actually doing harm. We're leaving women and girls with untenable choices. And then finally, the lack of opportunities. We know that we can mitigate risk through thoughtful, carefully planned, targeted programming interventions. Programming around the provision of firewood or alternative cooking fuel so that women aren't going out to collect this stuff and risking rape. Establishing safe spaces for girls where they can build their assets and actually learn how to make better decisions for themselves, have the self-confidence, the self-esteem to actually understand what bodily integrity means and the value that has for them. And we can do livelihood programs that actually don't expose women and girls to heightened risk, but are designed in such a way to mitigate those risks that new programs might expose them to, or new opportunities might expose them to. So we have the tools to at least reduce risk. Why aren't we doing it better? And I keep coming back to this as a practitioner. It's like we know some of this stuff. Why isn't it happening? And I think, like with all things, as you know, with every good thing, there's always some negative or unintended consequences. And as the humanitarian community has developed increasing expertise and professionalism, we've also become increasingly segmented and siloed. And I worry, I remember when I started this work 30 years ago, and you'd be plopped in, not with a lot of expertise necessarily, but plopped into a new emergency, and you just dealt with what was in front of you. You were a generalist, you looked at the needs, you looked at what can I do to respond, and I worry now that when we encounter somebody who has experienced gender-based violence, we leave that to the GBV expert. We leave the gender issues to the gender expert. We leave the disability, those persons with disabilities, to the disability organization. And that, in fact, in some ways, what we're doing then is losing some of that big picture. This growing expertise, I think, has led to a relinquishing, in some ways, of responsibility. So quickly, just to wrap up, making progress on the prevention of gender-based violence in these complex emergencies is going to require renewed collective action, comprehensive cross-sectoral, cross-programmatic approaches, a GBV prevention focus and lens on everything we do, and a system for accountability for organizations and individuals who do not adhere to this globally agreed to guidance. The humanitarian community has an imperative of do no harm, and that requires no less and means that the prevention of GBV is every one of those actors' responsibilities.
Thank you so much.
Can pick up the... Good afternoon. I'm Aurora de Dios. I come from the Philippines and have been participating in CSW events. My presentation today has born out of my experience being a convener of the Women's Peace Table. This is a network of women's organizations all over the country helping to end and resolve the decades-old conflict in the southern part of the Philippines between the Christians and the Muslims. And what I'm going to I think the presentations have been excellent, and I don't know what added value I can give to what has been said already. But in any case, I'd like to share with you just a bit of my experience here and some of the interventions which I think are necessary as well to address violence against women in a conflict setting. So what do we have in terms of, just to begin to reckon with what we already have in terms of addressing violence against women in general? I think we have, at this point, and participating in the last 10 CSW, and having been in the CEDAW as an expert for some years, tells me that there is increased awareness and genuine action of governments and civil society on violence against women and violence against children. Domestic law and policies, for example, international humanitarian and human rights law, as well as national and regional plans of action against VAW are there, with numerous governments adhering, reasonably to the regional plans of action. There we have all across the world vigorous campaigns against violence, yet violence is still pervasive, taking on different forms and modalities, such as cyber porn, which sexualizes violence against women and violence against children, that influence the gender, influences the gender socialization boys and young men. It's no surprise to me that in a period of conflict, in a period of emergency, that men will take advantage of women because they've had this all along in their minds, that women are for the taking, and especially when they are so vulnerable. Now what we have here is, as you can see, a dramatic increase in the number of international migrants. In the last so many years, we have 48% of these international migrants are women, and therefore could be are in very vulnerable situations in jobs, as we have heard in our earlier panel. And as you can imagine, with all the crises that's happening around the world, although the first to be affected are some of the most vulnerable migrants there are. So just an example of crisis where migrants have suffered, and I think Many of these are unexpected, and there is the Gulf War, for example. A lot of Filipinos were trapped in the homes of their employers. Some have had to jump off the windows, and a lot of them have, encountered accidents. Many were raped because they were left to fend for themselves. You had the Asian tsunami, and it affected families of many Asians married to Japanese. You have the Libyan crisis, where hundreds of thousands were transferred or had to be repatriated. In East Asia and Pacific alone, accounts for 60% of deaths as a result of natural disasters. So climate change has got to do as well with this crisis that we're now experiencing. Okay, so this earthquake and tsunami in Japan caused huge damage to the northeastern part of Japan and changed the lives of Japanese and non-Japanese residents of the area. So up to now, because of the nuclear explosion there, communities are still uninhabited, and the others have to flee to those safe places. There is a correlation between the stress that people experience during conflict or natural disasters and the domestic violence that happens in the aftermath. And this is recorded and documented in many instances, such as in Japan, where spousal abuse among interracial marriages have increased noticeably. Also, the incidence of child abuse has also risen 2 years after the natural and nuclear disasters. This is not a very good picture. This was just happening last week, 2 weeks ago. People fleeing from recent fighting between government forces and terrorist groups in central Mindanao. This is a very vivid picture of what happens after men, women, children struggling to get their rations of food. And as you can see, the women and the children are the ones that are being squeezed out. This is a site of the immediate evacuation camp because not only a few groups are fleeing, the whole communities have been, and there are hardly any facility to accommodate them. This was it is still happening up to this time. So crisis migration is, these people are involuntary migrants, or what we call forced migrants. So what is this new normal that we're seeing? Migration crisis is a term that describes the complex and often large-scale migration flows and mobility patterns caused by a crisis, which involve vulnerabilities for individuals and affected communities. A migration crisis may be sudden or slow in onset, as in cases of desertification. What trends that we see now in terms of forced migration are several of these worrying and terrifying prospects. Increase in armed internal conflicts brought about by weak states, where there is a general breakdown of law and order, as has been mentioned. Environmental and climate change crisis, that may be sudden or slow. Forced migration due to health crisis like Ebola. We haven't seen something like this, no, that affects, and frightens communities. Forced migration due to anticipated attacks of brutal and marauding terrorists like Boko Haram and ISIL that targets women and girls and communities with different ethnicities. And forced migration due to violent conflict triggered by competing claims over essential resources, water, land, or even cultural sites. Yes, there are warring states over some temple or religious. Now, just to illustrate, this is, like an illustration of how the vulnerabilities happen. So you may want to see that this is, migrants are sometimes crossing borders and their mobility is sometimes from regular to irregular. And along the way, irregular cross-border asylum seekers become IDPs. Some of them may fall into traffic syndicates and they become traffic persons. And some of them would have resorted to facilitators who can bring them over to the border and they are smuggled. So any of these categories of migrants are going to be subject to a lot of violence. Now, these are, I will not dwell on this, just to point out that there have been an increasing number, an escalating number of victims. Okay, I will not repeat that. This has already been mentioned by Erin, that the dispersal, which in future will become diasporic communities. Okay, there's also been an increase in the number of disasters, and many of them are climate related. We do not yet know to what extent this will increase in the future. This is like 20 million people have already been affected, and by 2050, 200 million to a billion forced migrants will have to move out because of these disasters. So this has been mentioned already. The extreme vulnerabilities of women and migrant women trapped in conflict situations. Okay, the lack of passport, the lack of